Hey everybody, welcome to Naturalistics, a podcast designed to help you become a better naturalist. I'm Stefan.
And I'm Matt. Hello everyone. Welcome to episode 2. On Naturalistics, on each episode we choose a topic and explore ways in which we can improve as naturalists. If you're interested in what a naturalist is, you can check out episode 1. And for this episode, we're going to talk about wildlife tracking. And we're going to talk about following animal footprints and identifying animal footprints and how we can improve at that skill as naturalists. It's one of those really hallmark skills of a naturalist. Almost any naturalist I know uses that skill. But before we get into that, Stefan's got a quick story for us.
Yeah, I have something that I wanted to share with you, Matt. So the other day, I guess it was Saturday, I was on my way back from the dump, recycling center, and I live in Sandwich, New Hampshire. There's a lot of open meadow land and stone walls. It's sort of like your typical New England country setting. And so picture I'm driving along, and there's a big open meadow off to my right, and as I drive by this open meadow, sort of out of the corner of my eye, I pick up this black shape, which is sort of moving a little bit, somehow registers in my mind as, something not stationary. And I was trying to think, what was that? Was that like somebody's dog sitting out in the field? Something black and moving, probably a living thing. And so I had to turn around and go back and see what this was. And so I turn around, go back, and I pull up and pull off to the side of the road and turn off the truck. And there's a raven sitting out in the middle of this meadow, and kind of like looking at the snow, and then at intervals, sort of like hopping up and down, like almost like sort of like trampoline, kind of like hop, 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 and then put the bill down, sort of towards the snow, maybe into the snow, and it did this several times, and then suddenly just took off and flew away from me towards the trees. And it looked like it may have had something in its bill, something sort of light colored, it looked like maybe, in its bill.
Yeah, weird.
Yeah, so just a weird thing. I'd never seen anything quite like that before, and thought it'd be worth...
Well, I mean, it's weird on the one hand, but on the other hand, I feel like I've seen corvids, which are, the group that ravens and crows and jays are all a part of. I feel like I've seen them do that before, in particular ravens. I can't quite remember, but I've got a few questions for you. So first is, are you sure it was a raven?
I'm confident that it was a raven. I didn't have my binoculars.
Was the raven facing you or facing away or like quartering away?
Facing... Yeah, sort of like parallel face. If I'm in my truck on the road facing down the road, the raven was facing this in the same direction.
Probably
in profile. Profile.
Yeah. Were there any other corvids around, like other ravens or crows or? No,
and I spent a few, maybe like a minute there observing it, and it wasn't very birdy. It was like middle of the day, and. No, not really. I mean, it was pretty isolated, away from trees.
Yeah, right.
Right out in the open, and there were no other corvids or any birds nearby interacting that I could see.
Right. Yeah. I mean, corvids are weird. They do they have a lot of strange behaviors for sure.
Which is one of the things that makes them so curious, to observe and.
Yeah, and anytime we study corvids, putting them in a special category of their own is definitely important. Being like, okay, this is a corvid behavior. Like when we study bird language, there's the corvid disclaimer we always say, because you can study all kinds of birds, and then you start to study corvids, and there's just like totally weird stuff going on with their communication and body language and all kinds of stuff. But definitely the jumpy raven. We'll keep an eye on that and see if it comes up again.
Yeah,
answers from me.
You think that's a thing, though? Like it is sort of like a.
That's why I think
a corvid behavior.
I wonder about this time of year and if ravens use big spaces like that for any courtship.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been a courtship thing, maybe even without another raven there. they're just kind of, maybe it's a young raven that's finding its lekking spot. Like,
yeah.
I don't know.
Getting into
We'll have
the
to look
groove.
into it. Maybe we'll come back to that next episode and update people on it. But anyway, yeah, that's cool.
And that rolls nicely, Matt, into a point that we wanted to bring up, which is that both of us live in New England, and so, like you're mentioning with the raven, the possible tie-in to courtship and their life cycles and a lot of the stuff that we discuss on the podcast. A lot of specifics will be with that sort of New England lens. So like the fact that ravens are going to be are starting to court and will be nesting soon.
Yeah. I mean, some of our show topics will be inspired by what's happening in our neck of the woods. So like today's topic is tracking and winter.
Mm-hmm. Midwinter.
A lot of people associate tracking with winter. It's just
snow tracking is, especially for people who are just getting into it, it's just a bounty of material to dive into.
Yeah, snow's great for tracking. And as we move forward and make more episodes, there'll be a lot of our podcast episodes will be seasonally based. Yeah, and for those who may or may not be listening from distant lands that are not seasonal, we really are going to be trying to speak to overarching themes in the naturalist world that apply anywhere. So you'll hear some of that in today's topic as well.
Like specific examples might draw from our experience in New England, but the meat of our discussion topics are going to be geared towards practical stuff that can be applied anywhere for naturalists anywhere, of all different experience levels, anywhere in the world. So,
So with that, should we roll right into it?
Let's do it. Yeah, tracking.
All right, tracking. So, what is tracking anyway?
I don't know if you call this a loaded question. There, it's you can get. There's definitely a rabbit hole here that you could go down with tracks. I think of tracks as a record of something that has taken place. In the same way that a track on an actual audio record is, it's interesting the language element of it, but like you have tracks on a record, and it's the same thing to me. The word is perfect for tracks. Animal tracks, if it's footprints in the snow or in the mud, or maybe it's broken branches or a bit of fur or scat.
Yeah.
All these things I would lump together as tracks under the definition of it's a record of something that has taken place.
Trackers are like the Sherlock Holmes of nature, right?
Totally.
Right?
It's like the magnifying glass and the footprint kind
it's
of.
Kind of
it's
silly,
like,
but
it almost is a little like forensic kind of. In that sense.
It's trying to uncover something that happened.
That happened. Yeah, there's definitely like a past tense. Right up to like past is in like a split second ago.
Yeah.
Tracks are being made in all different places all the time by lots of different things, not just wildlife.
Some of my mentors have asked me the question, what isn't a track?
Yeah.
Which has been an interesting one for me to think about.
It's almost the better question.
Yeah.
Really.
What isn't a track? It sounds a little goofy, but it really gets to the point of everything is the cause of something that came before it and can be tracked back to that.
I think your chair that is ripped up, very evidently ripped up by a cat, which you've mentioned in the past. I think that's a great example of that. Like, that's totally a track. Again, it's an animal, but it's something that you maybe take for granted. If you're inside, you're maybe not thinking about tracks and tracking, but you see that chair, and even if you're not consciously processing this, you're taking that information in, and your subconscious might be saying, "There's a chair ripped up by a cat." Looks like
Exactly.
You don't necessarily know that maybe it just got frayed and rubbed on something.
And it's the track of Trish's house. This person who gave it to me, this chair, has a lot of cats in their house,
right?
So it's like a Trish track in some ways, and then we can go back further from there, and like the design of the chair, and like how it has some strange pillow element here, which you can't see if you're listening, but the leather. Like, that's why is this here? This is somebody designed that. That's a track of whoever designed that, whoever chose the color. I mean, you literally can apply this to anything. where did this come from? Or what is this teaching me? Is another sort of a broader tracking question I've heard sometimes. What is this telling me? Is a better way to say it.
What's the story?
So you can look at something and say, what is this telling me? Like, you can look at the color of the wall and say, what was the person who chose this wall color thinking? Like, why did they choose that color?
Yeah, what were they thinking?
What were they thinking? I know, it's pretty ugly. But
often it's what were they thinking with the shake of the head.
But you can apply that to anything. And still that question of what isn't a track is helpful for me. I can walk anywhere and be tracking. So then you get asked the question, well, what isn't a track, and when am I not tracking? Because I can track anything, anywhere, if I apply that.
Right.
But
we can zoom back in from there.
Yeah.
It's kind of like we establish that you have to start by thinking of a track as evidence of something that happened, and then you can zoom back into how does this apply in a large part for a naturalist or someone who's interested in this sort of stuff. Animal footprints in the snow could be a bulk of what you're observing as tracks. Even though you could be tracking, like you say, anywhere, inside, outside, wherever you are, there's tracks everywhere, and you could be tracking everywhere, all the time.
Yeah.
Today we're mostly focusing on animal tracks.
Yeah, so we're going to narrow in here a little bit, and the episode, we definitely want to focus on wildlife in particular, and that's a huge interest for naturalists and nature folks out there, is figuring out how to navigate that world of wildlife tracking, which is super fun. And if you haven't really dove into that world, definitely we recommend that. So,
yeah,
we got some tips.
Yeah, we have some tips. Again, these tips are not focused so much on helping you to identify a particular track, although we may, if you do have any questions on that, you have maybe a mystery track you'd like to have us take a look at, we're happy to spend some time on that. But mostly what we're talking about here is how you can become a better tracker.
Yeah. Before we dive in, I just wanted to mention differentiating between track identification and tracking, as in trailing animals. Track ID is sort of coming up upon a footprint, let's just say, or a sign of an animal, and identifying who made that sign or that track, and maybe asking some other questions and sort of teasing other things out, like how big was this animal, when did it come through, gender is this animal,
how was it moving,
all those kind of questions. But trailing is where you are actually, it's the skill of following an animal to the animal. That's another thing about tracking, is every footprint at the end of the trail is the animal, which is really cool. Mm-hmm. And it's a real skill that you can practice, and there's people out there who are incredibly good at this, and they can follow animal track to the animal. And that takes a lot of time and practice. We're not really going to dive into that too much today. Maybe we'll cover that in another episode.
Or it could be multiple other episodes around trailing.
But we're focusing on track ID.
So this can be a single track. It can be a woodpecker hole in a tree. It could be a bug hole in a tree. One footprint, a partial footprint, a scratch mark. It might not be something worth trailing, but it can be something that you can track and possibly identify the source of that track.
Yeah, definitely. And
so a lot of this gets into process, right, Matt?
Yeah, and I think I want to just mention something, we didn't write this down, but I'm realizing how important this is, that all of my tracking mentors, naturalist mentors, have mentioned this, that when you come upon these things, you got to fight this initial gut reaction that I see in other people, I see in myself, which is to immediately spew answers. So I come across a track.
It's a gray fox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That can really be getting in the way of gaining deeper lessons or learn. I mean, you could just be dead wrong too. It kind
of jumps the Triforce.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
kind of going from question to story.
Yes.
Without going through observation.
Yeah. Yeah.
and reflection.
Yeah, exactly. So you really got to take that time to when you have tracks and you want to figure out what they are, let's say, just shy away from right off the bat saying what they are. That's probably the number one tip. Like, we could close the podcast with that, and that would be
if you can apply this to your tracking, you will become a better tracker.
So yeah, seriously, and before you name the track or come up with any answers that you have for it, ask some questions about the track and process these things. So the first thing you want to do is assess, like, what am I looking at? That's kind of one of the first questions that seems to be important to ask is, what do I see? And that goes to that observation right down there, to the observation section, because it says, what do you see? So, some examples of that. What are some examples of something you could see, Stefan?
You could see a shape.
Yeah, exactly.
It could be I see something round. You can begin with some things where it's like, well, duh, but you can begin with things where it's like, what can I say for sure about this?
Right.
Like, what can I absolutely say for sure about this? I see that it's deep. I see that it's a deep impression.
Yeah.
I see that it's round.
Yeah.
Even going a little bit further, but maybe jumping ahead, I see what look like toes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's sort of a basic thing. You could count the toes. If you feel like and this is you're sort of moving along this track. Once you are already into tracking, there's not a lot of value in trying to ID tracks. Spot identification. Just like, what is it? It's a cat.
Yeah. Long story short is that stop, ask the question, what do I see, and spend some time there. Spend at least a minute. I would say minimum a minute. And once you ask that, then you can go into a few more questions. And just going to call this the sort of art of questioning, or the who, what, when, why, how of tracking. So you can ask any of these 5 questions and apply what you see to those questions. So you can say, I see 4 toes and claws. And then you say, who might it be? And then you have a list of, maybe it's a dog, maybe it's a cat with its claws out. And then you can say, what? What was it doing here? What was it eating? When was it here?
How was it moving?
How was it moving is a great one.
At speed. Like, for example, I was tracking this morning, and there was a really clear two coyotes coming down onto the ice on a pond, and they were just tearing across this pond. Toes like totally splayed out. There's just a thin dusting of snow over the ice, and it was just full gallop. And then we saw other coyote trails same morning that looked very different because it was just a pretty moderate trot.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a great question. How is it moving here?
Yeah.
Not how is it moving, earlier that day, later that day, but like how is it moving in this moment?
Yeah.
When this track was recorded.
Yeah. So once you've asked what do I see, and you've spent some time there, just looking directly up, observing what you see, then spend some time in the questioning phase of the who, what, when, why, how, where, isn't it too? And it could be any form of those questions. Like Stefan was saying, it's just about applying and poking at it with some questions.
Where is it coming from? Where is it going?
Yeah,
There's two different versions of a where question that it can apply to any track.
Yeah, and I think again, try not to jump to answers right from there. I think it's just good process to just shoot out a bunch of questions and see where those might lead you to. And then maybe spend some time, like once that questioning phase is over, maybe it's time to pull out a field guide and really get down to maybe some thoughts on what you think it might be. And one tool for figuring out the who, and it's usually a really interesting one, one tool is master listing, which I find is really, really useful for my tracking process. And that basically means once I've established what do I see, spent a good amount of time there, and I've asked some other more broader questions of this track, then I can say, okay, what are my top 3 or my top 5 animals that have made this track? And sometimes I'll put things on there that might even seem like a little bit outlandish. Like, they don't really make any sense in some ways. Like, for instance, I remember some tracks I saw recently. I had to put frog on the master list, even though it's winter, because it looked like frog tracks almost. But when I first thought frog, I was like, no, it's impossible. But I had to keep it on my master list at first, just to, like, check myself and make sure I wasn't making any assumptions, because it's weird out there sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
So, master list a few things. You know, oftentimes when we see candid tracks,
it's a group of 3.
Yeah, so we're going to be saying, is it a domestic dog, is it a coyote, or is it a fox? And there's 2 types of fox around here. But and so we kind of, if it's a candid track, we were almost always starting with our 4.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking wild canid. If you feel like you could say it's a wild canid, you got your 3.
Right. Yes.
In our area.
Yeah.
But yeah, domestic. If you're in an area where there's domestic
dog,
that can look like
crazy.
Any of those 3.
They're almost on any canid. Yeah, it can look like domestic dog, or domestic dog can look like any canid.
Yeah.
But
so
the
different breeds.
And then the thing about master list is, like, now you've got your master list and you've got all the possibilities, even like really fringe possibilities. Then you can start to eliminate things based on what you see. So go back to what you see and say, okay, does it have claws?
Or does it register claws?
How many toes does it have? Size, habitat.
Where are the toes?
Time of year.
On the print.
All these kinds of things can cross things off that master list.
Yeah, so time of year and weather would help you rule out your frog. In the example you gave.
Not necessarily, but yeah, it did in that case.
Help.
Yes.
It would help.
Sometimes you get a warm day and a frog comes out. It's weird. But the idea of the master list is to start with all the possibilities and then narrow in on the 1 or 2 that are really close. And sometimes you might not get down to 1, you know? And I think that it's important to, like with your Raven story earlier, where we don't really know, but is to process these things and be okay with not having an answer immediately, and maybe going to other people. You can bring it to us, Naturalistics, and we'll see what maybe we might think about it. But yeah, that's sort of like the quick and dirty tracking process.
Yeah, number 1, like the first step really is don't jump to conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, and that's
like step 1. Stop yourself.
Yeah.
And then move on to step 2.
Yeah, and step 2 is what do I see? And then step 3 is the art of questioning, applying questions to the tracks without looking for answers. And then specifically for who, but also I think you can use the master list for all kinds of things. But it really is helpful for the question of whose track is this, is using that master list to narrow in.
Yeah. One thing, I think this is one area where having those questions in your mind, like you said, not necessarily trying to have those questions lead you immediately to an answer, but to just have the question in your mind, especially if you're moving on from one track and you have a set and you're gathering more information, like if you're on a trail.
Right.
Having that question in mind, not having an answer, not saying, oh, well, I think it's hunting, and then continue to gather information with that, but rather saying, what is it doing? What am I doing if I'm this animal?
Yeah,
right
nice.
Here.
Getting into the animal perspective, for sure.
And having that question rather than a supposition of what whatever the first idea that you have of what this animal might be doing. As you continue to gather information, having the question in your mind is more helpful than having that supposition of I think this animal's hunting.
Yes.
Because then as you take in the new information, it's more likely to be processed accurately than if you're going to process everything with sort of like tarnished by, if it's hunting, then this,
Yeah.
You're kind of almost making an assumption there, which could skew your, you know, where it leads you from there. It's kind of like steering you, you know, further and further from the mark.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of makes me think about this main point of naturalistics that I think is really important, that I find that I really want to stress this, and we'll come back to this a lot, is this idea that identification is the ABCs of the naturalist, and that knowing the names of things is an incredible tool. It is the ABCs, because it helps you learn the language of nature. It's
kind of what gets you into this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to imagine almost being a naturalist without knowing any names of any species. But at the same time, it can be a hazard because people can get stuck on the ABCs.
Yeah.
Can get stuck on identification, and definitely with tracking. Getting stuck on the who question all the time for every track you find is like my version of hell. No, alright, that's a little extreme. But seriously, there's just so much more. There's so many more interesting questions.
Yeah, it's kind of like getting your feet wet rather than diving in and swimming around.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's like, let's not be afraid to ask those questions, even if we don't find the answers to them. And who can be sort of low-hanging fruit sometimes, because that process can be so refined and you can get so good at answering the who question.
Yeah, especially the more experience you have, the better you become at recognizing patterns and
that's great.
Shapes.
And answering that question is really cool and powerful.
And again, it can be the motivating factor to get you out there and get you tracking.
Yeah, finding a specific species. But
the ABC, like you said, the ABCs are really important.
Yeah.
But they're still the ABCs.
It's still the ABCs.
And it's not poetry. And it's not, it's not a novel. It's just the ABCs.
Yeah.
And it's really just a way of unlocking so many other doors.
Yeah. So we want to use identification as the means to the language.
The language of tracks.
The language of tracks, the language of nature. But we don't want to get stuck there. So we just want to put that out. I mean, we'll be coming back to that one, I'm sure, again and again and again. But,
yeah, one way of thinking of it, I don't know if this will help anyone, but you can know what something is without knowing that thing. You know, you can know
the name.
You can know the name of something without, in fact, knowing that. So it's like a bird. Like you could know a black-capped chickadee without knowing the name. Black-capped chickadee. You can know the bird without knowing the name of the bird. And likewise, you can know the name of the bird without knowing the bird at all.
Exactly.
And so getting stuck on knowing what animal left that track rather than knowing the animal itself.
Yeah. It gets at somewhat like a core philosophy of naturalistics, which I think is that we value the process of natural history and being a naturalist more than the results. I think we might have talked about this in episode 1 a little bit, but that I value naturalists that are a wealth of rich, deep understanding of nature, as opposed to encyclopedic naturalists who just are fact-storing machines.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the who question and the identification, is that we want to value that, but it's not the ultimate goal. It's not the ultimate goal of the naturalist to know every species ever. Yeah. So anyway,
identify tracks, but don't get stuck there.
Don't get stuck there.
And another good thing which can help you with all this stuff, becoming a better tracker, all the things that we're talking about are much easier to hold yourself to and to improve on and all that if you have community around you who are also, share your interests. I guess not to track alone is the key thing here that applies in particular to tracking.
Definitely to tracking in particular. I mean, because a lot of naturalist activities are sort of inherently solitary activities. Certainly. Because, for instance, bird watching, it's just so much easier to get close to birds
when you don't have to coordinate with
when you're alone,
other folks.
And you can just be way quieter. and that's fine. But the thing about tracking is that it's not like identifying birds. Most birds that are of the same species look the same. There might be different plumages for females and males, or juveniles and adults. But the thing about tracking is that every single track looks different than every single track. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so difficult and what makes it also so interesting. So the hazard of tracking alone is that you can always be right.
Right.
You don't have if you don't have anybody to check your assumptions and what you're seeing, because they might see things differently than you. And that's really cool and interesting. So just wanted to put that out there. Don't track alone. Do it with other people.
Yeah, I guess this community element applies to pretty much everything that we'll talk about.
For sure.
For a naturalist to have community is really a big part of our definition of a naturalist.
Yeah.
You know,
almost made it to the Triforce, I think.
Yeah, it's not quite essential, but from the definition standpoint, it's not quite essential. From our standpoint of trying to help people become better naturalists, I think it is almost an essential
probably one of
tool.
the biggest legs up that you can give yourself.
If you have a mentor, or even if you just have someone else who doesn't know, maybe knows even less than you do about tracks or birds or whatever it is you're talking about, just to have someone else to process it with, it can keep you excited and keep you engaged. So yeah, it applies to tracks, but it'll apply to across the board.
Yeah,
to all categories of naturalist studies.
Well, cool. I think that's going to about wrap us up for this episode. And so I just want to thank everyone for listening. And like we said, we really want to encourage people to find community, and we welcome your comments, thoughts, and feedback for us. And if you have any tracking mysteries, tracking pictures, questions, send them our way.
Maybe we'll discuss one of your little stories or curiosities on our next episode.
Sounds good. See you then.
Thanks.
Ready?
You ready?
All right, I'm talking. Hey,
Stefan's talking.
Baloney, 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 baloney sandwich.
Okay, that was good.